Good morning. I'm Tracy Osborne-Olchin, President of the Overland Park Chamber of Commerce, and I'm so glad that you joined us today for this briefing from our partner, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I've worked with the U.S. Chamber for over 30 years, and I have always appreciated the excellent advice and advocacy they have done on behalf of our chamber and, of course, you all, our business members. But there's never been a time when it's been so true as it's been in these last couple of weeks, when they have been there for us and we have relied upon them on absolutely a daily basis. For their voice has represented all of us on the Hill and at the White House, keeping us informed through briefings and through the excellent guides that they've produced that enabled all of our businesses to access resources that will help preserve jobs and keep our businesses going through these trying times. I want to take this opportunity to thank Jack personally for his work and that of the extraordinary team back in DC and of course all across the country who represent each and every one of us. To say that these are unprecedented and challenging times has really become a cliche and an understatement. From day one, your Overland Park Chamber of Commerce staff team has been focused on three things. First, curating the very best resources to get those to you quickly, contacting you to find out exactly what you need, and of course, advocating for you at every level of government to save jobs, and now to get back to business as quickly as possible, as soon as we are safely able. And we are going to talk about doing just that this morning. First, I'm appreciative of the support of all of our corporate partners, Advent Health, Black & Veatch, Central Bank of the Midwest, Empower Retirement, HCA, Menorah Medical Center, and Overland Park Regional Medical Center, and the new T-Mobile Sprint, as well as our corporate sponsors and Leadership Circle members you see on the welcome screen. We especially want to thank and recognize FNBO, First National Bank of Omaha, for sponsoring this virtual event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our Senior Vice President of Public Policy, Kevin Walker, who is going to introduce our speaker this morning and give a few housekeeping. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I join Tracy in welcoming everyone here. Couple quick housekeeping items. First of all of our attendees are going to be automatically muted. There will be a Q&A at the end of Jack's presentation. And if you're not familiar with it, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your window. You can just click on that and submit your question. And for mobile users, if you click on participants, then you'll find the Q&A feature there. We will get as many questions answered as possible. And if we run out of time for some reason, we will certainly submit those questions to Jack and try to provide those answers later. And so without further ado, let me introduce Jack. Jack Howard is a Senior Vice President of Congressional and Public Affairs Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That division includes a team of 15 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., as well as 7 regional offices that are charged with providing membership services and grassroots lobbying. Jack is responsible for developing the strategy and leading the tactical execution of the Chamber's congressional lobbying activities, coordinating resources in Washington and around the country. He ensures that the division's mission and objectives align with those of the Chamber. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jack and we'll get started.
I really appreciate the very kind introduction and happy to be with you all. As I was saying earlier, it actually feels good in addition to just dealing with a lot of these policies in the abstract. It feels good to be able to talk to people directly, particularly people who are on the front lines of trying to keep their businesses open and trying to keep their employees employed. So I'm happy to be with you. I think we're going to do a couple of things here today. First, just kind of talk very kind of broadly about the CARES Act. I think most people are probably pretty well familiar with kind of the overall outlines of the bill, particularly as it relates to small businesses and the Paycheck Protection Program and various other features. And then we'll move on to where we're really starting to turn a lot of our attention, which is how and when to begin to reopen businesses. So let me just start with a real kind of top line. I find doing these things, it's useful to remind people that the Paycheck Protection Program and the small business programs are just one element of a much broader package, some of which may actually help people, individuals and businesses who are really struggling, and give them some additional options that they may want to try to explore. So just as a reminder, this is, we can go to the first slide, Celia. This is a huge package, $2.2 trillion. To put that in perspective, the phase 2, this is called the phase 3 bill. The phase 2 bill was, I think, a little over $100 billion. Phase 1 was $8 billion. So just literally in the space of about 6 weeks, we've gone from a very small targeted piece of legislation to just a huge, massive infusion of money and resources into the economy, particularly aimed at sustaining small businesses. On top of that, there are, because of the new programs for the Fed, new and expanded programs for the Fed, it actually creates the potential for an additional $4 trillion when you factor in leveraging. So that gives you a sense of the scale, but it also of this program. But it also tells you how much more is going to be needed, because obviously this bill, there are a lot of glitches, and I hear all the frustration with the SBA process. Loans aren't going out fast enough, and there's an enormous amount of confusion. I don't discount any of that. As we saw this morning, the PPP programs actually run out of money. We can talk more about that when we go forward. But anyways, this is just phase 3 of the bill. We're expecting a phase 4 and probably a phase 5 as the scale of this pandemic becomes more apparent, both in terms of economic terms and in terms of just real impact on individuals. So it's a $2 trillion package. More money's coming, both by virtue of being approved by Congress, but also through the Fed. In the short term for people, I just want to remind people that there is individual tax payments coming to people. Should be hitting, if it hasn't already, shortly in the next few days, weeks, $1,200 per individual, $2,400 for a joint return, plus another $500 for people with per child. And that's phased out for people with incomes over $75,000, $150,000 for joint filers. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, there's a very robust unemployment program, expansion of the current program. Pretty much virtually all of the restrictions on eligibility that existed under the old system have been suspended, as long as it's all related to the coronavirus. So people should be getting another $600 per week on top of your regular state benefit. And that extends until July 31st. However, I've heard several reports, not just from Kansas, but states' unemployment systems are overwhelmed, and processing those checks is taking a lot longer than people had hoped. But in any event, for people who have unfortunately found themselves having to file for unemployment, we saw 5 million more this morning, I think, which brings the total up to over 20. There is some help on the way, slower than people would like, but it is starting to move through the system. In terms of understanding how this bill is supposed to work, I try to remind people to keep in mind the broader concept, and it kind of goes back to the point I was saying before about this is just phase 3. This bill, phase 3, is really just a bridge to avoid a prolonged and much deeper recession. The whole idea is to give people, to buy time really, for businesses and employees to either stay open or reopen. So next slide, please, Celia. Some of the other provisions for all employers, in addition to the ones targeted just at small businesses, for all employers, there's going to be a significant amount of tax changes. There's going to be a new employee tax credit for larger employers. I talked a little bit about the Treasury programs. There's a whole series of loans, loan guarantees, Federal Reserve credit facilities that are low. So with that as kind of lead in, I just want to talk real quickly about some of the tax changes. Next slide, please, Celia. For all employers, there's a significant delay option for delaying your employer portion of the payroll taxes. That's the Social Security portion. So employers have the option to delay the employer portion of the payroll tax between now and January 1st, 2021. If they avail themselves of that option, they have to pay 50% of the accumulated amount they would have owed by the end of 2021, December 31st of 2021, and the remainder would have to be paid by 12/31/22. It's important to remember, however, that if you manage to get a loan under the Paycheck Protection Program, you cannot delay your payroll taxes. So it's an either/or proposition. Just real quickly on some of the tax changes, because this is something we worked very hard on to try to make improvements to the bill, particularly the initial draft as introduced by Senator McConnell. In the area of net operating losses, the bill expands the ability to use those losses by removing the current 80% income limitation on the use of those losses for tax years beginning 2021. And it allows you to, it permits the net operating losses arising in 2018, 2019, and 2020 to be carried back 5 years. In the area of business tax deductions, it increases the amount of deductible business interest expenses by easing the limitation from the current 30% to 50% of earnings for tax years beginning in 2019 and 2020. And it permits businesses to elect their 2019 income to determine their 2020 business interest deductions. So that's the net operating, or that's the business introduction feature. Bonus depreciation, this is what we refer to as the QIP, the Qualified Improvement Property Fix, otherwise known as the retail glitch. Turns out in 2017 in the tax reform legislation, Congress mistakenly excluded improvements to the interiors of non-residential buildings from the 100% bonus depreciation. And this bill fixes that. I mentioned the income tax rebates. The other feature, I mentioned the employee retention credit. That is a refundable tax credit against your payroll taxes equal to 50% of the first $10,000 in your qualified wages from March 13th to 2020 through the end of 2020. And I also mentioned real quickly the delay in the payroll tax. So those are some of the key tax changes that apply to all employers regardless of size. And again, the whole idea here behind this element is to increase liquidity for all businesses who have no revenue or who have lost significant amount of revenue as a result of the pandemic. It's not really about reducing your overall taxes. It's more about changing the timing of those payments so that, again, you have the liquidity you need to try to stay open. So let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about the employee retention tax credit. Thank you. This didn't get a whole lot of attention. And still really is not getting much attention. But this generally would apply to businesses and nonprofits are also eligible, who are either fully or partially shut down or have a 50% drop in their gross receipts in a quarter compared to the prior year until those receipts return to 80% of their income. It's intended to help employees who have shut down, as I said, or have lost revenue, but who continue to pay their expenses. There are some special rules in place that I want to make sure people understand, particularly for employers who have more than 100 employees. If you're shut down or partially shut down, you can still take advantage of the credit if the employee is not working or is teleworking, but you still continue to pay them. Now, for businesses who have fewer than 100 employees, that requirement that they are not providing services does not apply. It's available for all employees during the eligible period. And if you want to go to the Treasury Department's website, I believe they're issuing more guidance about how to use that credit and also how to allow advance payment of that credit. So I would encourage you to take a look at that website. So moving on to the mid-size and larger employers. Next slide, please, Celia. Thank you. This is pretty much where a lot of the liquidity will come from, how you get to over $4 trillion, as I mentioned earlier. So for employers who have more than 500 employees, the goal here is to provide support through Fed credit facilities. So it's like commercial paper, money market funds, a lot of the features that were used in the 2000-2009 economic recession. Essentially, it's $454 billion from the Treasury Department for loans, loan guarantees, or to support Federal Reserve credit facilities. That's $454 billion. Airlines and some other critical national security businesses make up the rest. And for that, they aren't expecting companies to go directly to the Fed. The money would go to lending institutions for them to make loans. So that's the way that's the idea behind that particular element of the bill. And then we'll move on to where I think most people want to talk about, which is the features for small businesses. And I'll try to, as I go along, try to knock out as many questions as I can. I think people are probably pretty well familiar with, and probably not too happy, from what I can gather, with the Paycheck Protection Program. But let me just kind of start by bringing people up to speed on the current state of play, which is that the program, as of this morning, is out of money. There's been a stalemate going on pretty much for, I'm losing track of time, over a week on the Senate side. Senator McConnell has been trying to ask unanimous consent to add another $250 billion to the existing $349 billion pot. Unfortunately, the Senate Democrats and House Democrats have their own kind of separate set of demands. And since the Senate is operating under unanimous consent because they're not in session, technically they're in session, they're in pro forma session, but the senators are not actually here and not planning to come back anytime soon to actually vote. So everything they have to do has to be done by unanimous consent. So Senator McConnell has been trying to ask unanimous consent to get the $250 billion. Senate Democrats, for their reasons, have been objecting. Senate is supposed to go back in session today, 3 o'clock. As we speak, negotiations are occurring between particularly Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Senate Democrats, and by extension, House Democrats. They would like more money for hospitals, state and local governments, a couple of other things. So it's still a stalemate. Discussions are occurring. I was talking to McConnell's staff this morning. They're really not even sure what's going to happen. they're not going to ask unanimous consent this afternoon, only to force an objection, because that won't help anything. So the program is suspended until they get more money. I'm confident, possibly later tonight, maybe the next pro forma session, I think, is Monday, sometime within the week. I have to believe that they'll reach some kind of an agreement on how to replenish that fund. And of course, that's on top of the fact that of the enormous frustration that people who've already applied for loans either haven't been able to get their loans processed or haven't been able to get their loans. So it's a bad situation. I don't mean to minimize that at all. But in any event, loans, like I said, are suspended last Friday. Independent contractors and self-employed individuals were able to apply. That's in addition to when the program started on April 3rd, small businesses and sole proprietorships were able to apply. I think everybody knows you apply through your existing SBA lender, a federally insured depository institution, and it's open to any business, including nonprofits, veterans organizations, tribal businesses, sole proprietorships, self-employed people, independent contractors with fewer than 500 employees. One of the controversies we've been dealing with is for 501c6 companies were left out of the program. We were very involved in trying to get them included when the bill first passed. I've heard a variety of different excuses since then as to why C6s were left out of the Paycheck Protection Program. None of them really kind of passed muster with me, but and the bottom line is they didn't make it in. So we are continuing. This is one of our top priorities going forward. We are continuing to bring pressure to bear, not only on leadership, but virtually all rank and file members. And I have to say, your senators have been really very helpful on this. Senator Moran, this is a big deal for him. He sent a letter to the leadership demanding that C6s be included in whatever the next recovery legislation is. That's been very helpful. Senator Roberts also has been very helpful behind the scenes in making the point that a lot of C6s are really struggling here. In fact, too many of them actually had to close their doors. So that's the state of play on that. I don't know that I really need to go over all the different requirements to apply. I think most people have already applied. They're familiar with the process. And so we can, if people have particular questions, we can try to answer them as when we get to the question and answer period. The other program that's available to small business is the EIDL program. That's people are eligible for up to $2 million for that. The interest rates for small businesses are 3.75%. For most nonprofits, it's 2.75%. Terms are up to 30 years, and the eligibility is based on the size, the type of business, and what types of financial resources you have. You can use the loan funds to pay for fixed debts like rent, for example, payroll, accounts payable, or other bills that could have been paid had the crisis not occurred. I think one of the key things, the unique features here about the EIDL loan or the Paycheck Protection Program, I should have mentioned before, is you can avoid a reduction in forgiveness if you bring back your employees and restore their wages, generally within 30 days and up until June 30th. So I think that's pretty much all I just wanted to mention on that one. Next, move on to the next slide. I think that talks a little bit more detail about, I think we skipped did we skip? Oh, there. That's the EIDL loan kind of parameters. Kind of covered that already. So we can move on to the next slide. There are a variety of different features in there for paid sick leave. It was in the phase 2 bill. They didn't quite get it right. So in phase 3, they came back and tried to make some adjustments, particularly for employers who have fewer than 500 employees. They are required to pay 10 days of paid sick leave as long as that leave is related to COVID-19. You can take it when you're quarantined, take care of a sick or quarantined family member, or take care of a child during a school closure. It's paid at a rate of $511 a day, 2/3 of maximum of $200 per day. So that's kind of the key elements of that. We can move on, Celia, I think, to the next slide. Same thing for family and medical leave. That's in addition to the sick leave, and so people would be eligible for 10 days of sick leave first, and then the 10 weeks of family leave after that. So that's kind of an overview of the CARES Act itself. I think I want to go over, because I think this is where people really want to spend a lot of their time on what we're planning to do or help our member companies planning to do as they begin to contemplate opening the government, or not the government, the economy and businesses. So earlier this week, we circulated to our member companies, state and local chambers, and also to people in the White House and congressional leaders, as frankly all members of Congress, start to kind of thinking, how do we actually implement a national return to work plan? And you saw the White House announced a series of task forces the other day. And so we're really kind of going through a pretty rigorous exercise ourselves, trying to understand what a return to work would actually look like. It's getting more and more attention by the day. And one of the things I've discovered, as well as the people who are really doing most of the work on this at the chamber, it seems like every time you ask one question, that begs 10 more questions. But this is what you have to go through in order to really kind of develop a well thought out plan, because you can't just flip a switch and everybody show up at work one day. It's going to have to be a very gradual, well thought out, phased in, and it's going to vary by a lot of different factors: location, sectors, business types, your size, and then really overriding all this, really the health status of your employees. So under pretty much any scenario that is developed, it's going to require considerable social distancing for a while, expanded use of personal protection equipment, and a lot of other countermeasures. And that doesn't even get into all the legal liability type questions. But the important thing is we have to start planning for this now, because the sooner we start planning for it, the more we'll be able to anticipate logistical problems, policy problems, legal problems, so that our businesses will be able to open as quickly and as safely as possible. So we have spent a lot of time with our member companies. We've engaged with the White House. We've engaged with different agencies, trying to help see what their thinking is, and also force some clarity on a lot of these issues going forward. So we've really focused on 3 key areas so far. And the first one is essential services and resources. The second one is the resolution, as I alluded to before, some of these key liability and regulatory issues. And then, probably the most important feature is support for businesses and individuals as they kind of begin to contemplate a lot of this themselves. So in terms of the essential services, just touch on some things that we're really looking at here. Starts with really kind of general health screening. The CDC recommended the other day that critical infrastructure employers screen certain employees for temperature, ideally before they actually come to work or the facility where they work. So in a practical sense, employers are going to have to acquire temperature checking equipment and develop a process to screen those people. So what does that look like? So we're going to have to rely on guidance from the CDC and other federal agencies to what's expected, because it's going to take some time for businesses to acquire that equipment and develop protocols, particularly in a legally appropriate way. Testing itself, there's going to have to be enough capacity, as well as a clear understanding as to who's actually responsible for administering the tests, who's paying for the tests, and under what conditions, and how do you actually check the test results. So that's what we'll be looking at in that area. In terms of personal protective equipment itself, if public health officials recommend that widespread use of PPE, masks, for example, we're going to need a lot of clarity on what's needed and who is responsible for providing that equipment, especially as probably likely shortages are going to exist. Transportation, how are people supposed to get back and forth to work? Particularly for people who rely on mass transportation, public transportation. I ride the metro back and forth to DC. It's usually packed. And so what are we going to do about that? Do we have to develop a system of staggered work times or different work hours? How do you spread the rush hour out? We don't know, but those are some of the questions we're asking our transportation people to dig deeper on. Childcare, again, childcare, people rely very heavily on childcare. That's going to be really directly affected when you think about it. What are they going to do in terms of social distancing? Are you going to keep the kids separated? Are you going to have to lower the teacher-child ratio? And a lot of childcare, companies are struggling anyway, even before all this. So employees are going to be coming back to work on a kind of a staggered basis. So how do you manage that? There's going to be more costs associated with, as I said before, social distancing, other types of equipment, staggered work time. So there's going to be a lot of pre-planning involved in how do you manage all that. And we haven't even touched on the legal and regulatory issues yet, and those will really make your head spin. Health privacy, even under normal conditions, that's a very complicated area for a lot of employers to deal with. But now we've got a whole other feature in terms of how do you verify, for example, an employee's coronavirus status and what's their vulnerability, particularly if they have underlying health conditions like diabetes or things like that. Discrimination claims, same kind of thing. Plaintiff lawyers are already going full throttle, looking at how do you employers who are conducting medically based or risk-based reopening, using underlying conditions as a factor, their age. They may find themselves exposed to liability under Age Discrimination Employment Act, the Americans with Disability Act. I mean, it's just the number of legal questions and complications are almost endless. So those are some, again, that's what our legal team looking at that. There's a whole set of safe workplace issues that need to be dealt with, particularly when you're dealing with personal protective equipment like masks, respirators, and other physical barriers, things like that. OSHA, requires employees to be responsible for ensuring the availability of that kind of equipment and training your employees on the use of that equipment. So that's a whole other area that's ripe for a lot of lawsuits. Independent contractors, same kind of thing. People who are in construction, professional services, online platform types of work. Business, you want to be able to provide the same type of workplace protections to independent contractors as you do for your regular employees. But you could also find yourself in a situation where that independent contractor ends up being classified as an employee. And that may be something that Congress is actually going to have to deal with through legislation. Employment practices, lots of issues associated there. Wage and hour issues for example, are employees compensated while getting tested or passed through screening? What's the leave policy, travel restrictions, telework protocols, worker compensation? Whole other raft of legal exposure there too. What about employers who are forced to lay off workers in response to social distancing and government mandated closures? There's a whole series of procedural requirements under the WARN Act, including giving employees advance notice about layoffs. In terms of exposure liability, this is really huge. It involves several types of claims that could be brought against businesses that have been designated as essential, as well as large swaths of the remaining business community once the economy is reopened. The core element of the claims is that a customer, employee, patient, member of the public, et cetera, was exposed to COVID-19 in a business facility, or as a result of the business's particular action or failure to act, and then that claimant becomes sick. So that ranges anywhere from simple negligence to strict liability to public nuisance. And then you're obviously dealing with states that are in municipalities are already struggling under the financial burden. So there's a lot to look at there. Product liability, same types of issues. Dealing with all these products and devices and new equipment to either protect against or deal with COVID-19. They may not have sufficient protection against particularly speculative litigation. Plaintiff's bar could also try to bring medical liability or malpractice claims arising from care decisions or lack of care due to equipment shortages, as well as simple mistakes due to long hours or staff shortages. Particularly nursing homes would be particularly vulnerable to that kind of legal exposure, and assisted living facilities for supposedly, allegedly failing to protect their residents or patients from contracting COVID-19. And then the whole other area, the securities litigation, class action lawsuits have already been filed against businesses impacted by the coronavirus, particularly cruise lines and pharmaceutical sectors, arguing that based on stock price drops resulting from the impact of the virus, and claims that the company should have been warning investors about the potential consequences if the world was faced with an unprecedented pandemic. Even just how employers communicate with their employees is going to be a tricky issue. Businesses are going to have to have a enhanced need to during the pandemic to communicate to customers through telephone, text messages, but that then runs the risk of running afoul of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and as a result may have to limit the use of important calls and texts. So same thing's true for businesses that are dependent on high density gatherings, like for the chamber itself, for example, or a lot of travel, entertainment venues, restaurants, bars, companies that host meetings and events, and many other businesses are only profitable when they can run those types of events and have the types of density that is just not possible under social distancing. So I covered a lot of ground there. Just kind of touched on some of the broader issues that we're just beginning to look at. But like I said, it seems like every time you sit down and talk to people, a whole range of other issues comes up that people really haven't contemplated. But that, I said, it's better you've got to get started now, because if we're going to reopen business and the economy anytime soon, as we all hope, all of this stuff has to be thought through in advance and not on the spot. Otherwise, we'll make a horrible situation that much worse. So having said that, I'm happy to take whatever questions or comments people might have.
Well, Jack, thank you so much. We appreciate your leadership and the leadership of the U.S. Chamber in dealing with these issues at the federal level. And I just want people to know that the Overland Park Chamber is engaged in these same types of conversations at the state level and at the local level. You know, we're all eager to get back to full-scale business operations as quickly as we can. And, you know, on its face, it sounds pretty simple. But just the things that you went through with the liability and the health issues and all that's there, you know, our businesses have so much to consider right now. And then you add all of that on top of it. It's just a daunting task in front of us to get back to full scale operations. So certainly, I think we're all unified in trying to make this happen as quickly as possible and as safely as possible.
No, we're going to be relying very heavily on you all too to give us advice, because you're the ones on the ground dealing with all this. So,
and we're starting to have those conversations now. We're gathering information from our members because, as people can imagine, you know, it varies greatly by sector as to what they're going to need to get back to full scale operations. So we're gathering that information and sharing that with our policy leaders, and certainly we'll work with you. I also want to mention, since one of this question was asked, these slides will be available. We are recording this session, and as quickly as possible after we conclude, we will get this posted on the Chamber's website. We have a COVID-19 resource section that we have created on our website. And if you've not been there, there's certainly a wealth of information, and we will add this as quickly as we can. And then one other thing I'll add is Jack mentioned the advocacy of Senator Moran and Senator Roberts in advocating for the inclusion of C6s. And I also would mention Representative Davids has also issued a letter to congressional leadership advocating for C6s as well. So, you know, our federal folks understand the impact that this has had just on the C6 community and is advocating for them. So with that, let me transition to the Q&A. And Jack, I know you've touched on this a little bit about the SBA program running out of money. And it sounds like you're optimistic that they will do more. Do you have any sense of how much more they might add?
well, I think, at least in the short term anyway, they seem to be pretty well settled on the $250 billion. Although, frankly, I was talking to some of the Senate staff yesterday and said, why don't you just take the lid off of this thing? I know it's, you know, it's a lot of money, but rather than having to keep coming back every few weeks and add another $250 billion, why don't you just take the lid off? And their point is very legitimate. Go back to what I was saying, they're operating in a unanimous consent agreement. So they have to get all 100 senators to agree, as well as 435 members of the House. So you got to get 535 members of Congress to agree to something like that. And that's, yeah, it's going to be a staggering amount of money. But I think at least in terms of the short term, they seem like they've settled on, both sides agree, it seems like they need $250 billion. And it's still not going to be enough. I mean, as I said earlier, this just started April 3rd, which is barely 2 weeks. And it's already out of money. So it sounds like it's $250 billion. There might be a few, you know, several other, I don't know, tens of billions or maybe even 100 billions for hospitals or things like that. But at least for today anyway, or foreseeable future, it's $250 billion, and then more to come as really the scale of the crisis becomes more apparent.
Good, thank you. Our next question gets into some of the details on EIDL. Do you have any sense of how long the time frame is between acceptance being announced and funds actually getting released to businesses?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is too long. And I've forgotten now what the timeline was, but I think initially they were hoping to get it out to people in 3 days. And that, I mean, they're not anywhere close to that. There's a series of problems, as I understand, with just administering the EIDL loan program. A lot of just very bureaucratic complications at SBA that's really slowing things down. You know, it's supposed to be, I think it was 3 days, but that's the way the statute worked. The actual implementation is much, much slower.
And also related to EIDL and PPP and the loan forgiveness. So the question is, for PPP and EIDL loan forgiveness for payroll, is it required to be the same employees or just that the dollars be used for payroll in general?
The dollars have to be used for different purposes. So one or the other could be used for payroll. The other loan could be used for expenses in addition to that. And we have a guide on our website that goes through and kind of clearly lays out which expenses can count for which. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. So you can't take both loans for the same purpose is the answer.
And another question that's been broached to me is, you know, if we get back to some semblance of normal business operations, and then, you know, God forbid this virus takes off again, is Congress looking that far ahead in terms of relief? If businesses have received relief under, you know, the current environment, and then we go back into another round of relief, do you think they'll be prohibited from going back to the well again, or what's the long-term forecast here?
My personal, there really hasn't been a whole lot of discussion. That's a good question. There hasn't been a lot of talk about kind of what would happen if we get hit with a second wave. But just my own personal view is Congress is going to be dealing with this issue one way or the other for at least the remainder of this year and probably well into next year as well. I go back to, I remember I actually worked in the White House in 9/11. And I was dealing with Congress. I was in legislative affairs, and the legislation kind of evolved in stages. There was kind of the first phase of legislation dealt with the Patriot Act and things like that. But and then it took on Homeland Security Department, and it's still going on. You know, almost 20 years later, Congress is still dealing with legislation affecting resulting from the 9/11 crisis. And I think that's what this is going to be. But I am convinced that given the nature of the crisis, Congress will, and the Fed will, and the Treasury Department will do whatever it takes to support employees. You know, there's some people raising concerns about, you know, the budget deficit and the national debt, but all taking a back seat at this point to just trying to help people get through the crisis. So this is going to be a long-term proposition, but in terms of congressional thinking, it really hasn't got that far ahead. I mean, there's a lot of questions about what they're going to do. They're currently scheduled to come back, I think, May 4th. I'm being skeptical as to whether they're going to be back in May.
Okay. Another question going back to PPP related to C6s. You know, we talked about our delegation being very supportive. What's your sense in the next round? Are you optimistic that C6s would get included?
Boy, I'd like to be optimistic. One of the concerns that we're dealing with is, since it's coming out of this kind of fixed pot of money, right? Initially $349 billion, now we hope another $250 billion. One of the concerns that was raised to me when we were trying to get them included in the first place was, there are so many C6s out there that if you put C6s in the PPP fund, that'll just further drain the fund. Well, okay, then make the fund bigger. That's kind of our response. So it's going to be hard, which is why we really are relying heavily on you all, state and local people, to weigh in with your members of Congress. And you know, it's working. I mean, they've really kicked up quite a bit of dust. I mean, I'm in regular contact with House and Senate Republican leadership staff and Democratic leadership staff. And the C6 issue is top of mind for everybody. And I know Senator Rubio, who's the chairman of the Small Business Committee, is very well aware of the controversy, and particularly because we've got the Florida chambers weighing in with him. And I'm told that they're working on trying to fix it, but it turns out it's a lot harder to actually fix than it would first seem at first blush.
And as you're dealing with folks on Capitol Hill, what kind of information do you need from our businesses? What's most helpful to you to help you advocate for our best interests?
I'm really glad you raised that, because what I find most effective are not so much the policy arguments or the statistics. The personal anecdotes are the ones that people really can kind of wrap their heads around, because this is such a blizzard of information and different policy arguments flying around and statistics. The real personal stories about people who are being directly impacted by having to close their business, or they're unemployed, or they can't get their loan. That's what I find to be most effective. Personal anecdotes.
And then I think you touched on this, but since it was specifically asked, I'll go back to it. In terms of approval on EIDL, what is that time frame from when somebody gets their paperwork submitted and when they should be able to expect a response?
They were promised within 3 days, but we're way past that. And it's just hung up internally at the SBA with the approval process. Between the SBA's requirements, the lender's requirements, there's just a lot of confusion. And frankly, a lot of the computer systems that the SBA is using are outdated. And so you literally have people who are having to deal with a lot of these applications manually, which, that's just the reality.
Well, I appreciate that, Jack. You have been a tremendous wealth of information. And again, we thank you so much for your advocacy and your leadership at the federal level. We don't have any more questions right now. And so I think we'll certainly wrap up for today. But again, this will be posted.
Yep.
And just want to tell our members out there that if you have concerns, if you have questions, please stay in touch with us. We're in regular communication with the U.S. Chamber. We're in regular communication with our elected officials at all levels, and we certainly are right there with you, and we're going to do everything we can to weather this storm, but we need to know what you all need. And the more you let us know, the more we can advocate on your behalf. So thank you all very much for joining us this morning, and certainly wish you all a great afternoon.
Great.
Jack, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Jack.